Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had always loved my birthday, but this one, my 30th, turned out to be something I would never forget. It all started a few weeks before when I began feeling a subtle unease. Nothing I could put my finger on, just an odd sensation that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the week leading up to the 14th of October that I realized something was off about the house. My family had lived in this old farmhouse for nearly a decade, a charming house on the edge of town that had seen its share of history. My parents always talked about how it had been a perfect fit for us, but I had never been too sure about it. It was an old house with creaky floors, drafty windows, and a strange tendency to make noises late at night. Over the years, I'd gotten used to the sounds, creaks, groans, whispers. It was all normal to me until that fall. A week before my birthday, I began hearing strange noises again. The house was quiet as usual during the day, but at night, the sounds started. It began with a soft tapping on the walls, as if someone was knocking from the other side. I assumed it was just the old house settling, but it was persistent, coming at odd hours. The knock would come at midnight, or sometimes later. At first, I thought it was just my imagination running wild, but as the days passed, I realized it wasn't. The tapping would come from different places. Sometimes the living room wall, sometimes the floorboards upstairs. I would check, but each time I did, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Then, on the night of October 13th, the night before my birthday, I woke up suddenly to the sound of footsteps in the hall. Slow, deliberate steps like someone was walking just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart racing. I called out softly, but there was no answer. I waited for what seemed like an eternity, but the footsteps stopped. After a few minutes, I summoned the courage to get up and check, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. There were no signs of anyone being there. It wasn't just the sounds that unsettled me. I started to feel a presence in the house, like someone was watching me. It wasn't always clear, but there were moments when I'd catch a glimpse of something from the corner of my eye, an image of someone standing just out of sight, or a shadow moving quickly across the room. When I would turn, nothing was there. I confided in my husband, Nick, about what I was feeling, but he just shrugged it off. He had always been more practical than I was, and he dismissed my worries as stress from work and the upcoming birthday celebrations. "It's probably just the house, Jen," he said. "You've lived here for years. It's an old place, and the sounds are just normal. You're fine." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, especially as my birthday drew closer. On the night of October 14th, Nick and I stayed up late after the party. We had a few friends over for a small celebration, and it was a great time, filled with laughter and love. But when everyone left, I felt an odd heaviness in the air. The house seemed too quiet, and the walls felt too close. I didn't want to admit it to Nick, but I was scared. Nick kissed me goodnight and went to bed early, exhausted from the party. But I stayed up, trying to distract myself. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. At first, I thought it was Nick, maybe coming to check on me, but then I realized that he was already asleep in bed. The figure was tall, and it had an ethereal, almost translucent quality to it. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with long, dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders. Her face was pale, and her eyes seemed hollow, staring directly at me with an expression that I can only describe as sorrowful. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, but I could feel her presence in the room, heavy, cold, and overwhelming. It was as if she was waiting for something, watching me, but I couldn't make myself move. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the figure vanished. I blinked, and she was gone. I rushed to the doorway, but there was no trace of her, no sign that anyone had been there. My breath came in short gasps as I stumbled back into the living room, clutching my wine glass in my shaking hands. I tried to make sense of what I had seen, but nothing about it made sense. It had been real, too real, but it couldn't be. There had to be a logical explanation. I went upstairs to check on Nick, but when I opened the door to our bedroom, I stopped short. The bed was empty. Nick was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through me as I scanned the room. I called his name, but there was no response. The room was unnervingly quiet. I rushed downstairs, calling for him, but the house was silent. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, but Nick was nowhere. My heart raced as the weight of the situation began to sink in. The only thing that had changed was the feeling, the sense of being completely alone. I was alone, but not alone. I stepped into the hallway, my breath coming in shallow bursts, and that's when I saw it again. At the far end of the hallway, standing in the shadow of the staircase, was the figure of the woman. She was still watching me, her hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't breathe. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but she raised a hand, pointing toward the stairs. It was then that I realized Nick wasn't missing. He had gone up to the attic. Without thinking, I ran to the attic door, my heart pounding. The door creaked open with a groan, and I stepped into the narrow hallway that led to the attic stairs. The air grew colder as I climbed the stairs, and the sounds of my footsteps echoed through the house, amplifying the silence. When I reached the top, I found him standing there, frozen in place, staring at something in the corner of the attic. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't react when I called his name. I followed his gaze, and there, sitting in the corner of the attic, was an old rocking chair. It creaked slowly back and forth as if someone were sitting in it, but no one was there. The air in the attic was thick with a presence I couldn't explain, and the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It was the same feeling I had had all night, but now it was suffocating. "Nick," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to go." But he didn't answer. He stood there, rooted to the spot, as though in a trance. His face had lost all color, and he was staring at the empty chair, unable to look away. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away, but he resisted, his grip tightening on the wooden beam above him. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were wide, filled with terror. "Do you see her?" he whispered. "Do you see the woman?" I looked back at the rocking chair, but the woman was gone. Nick collapsed to his knees, his face pale with fear. It was her birthday too. It was then that I realized that the figure I had seen wasn't just haunting our house. It had been waiting for something, and it had been tied to that day. The 14th of October wasn't just my birthday, it was hers too. And as Nick's trembling voice filled the attic with a final confession, I understood the terrifying truth. She had been there, waiting for us to uncover the past that had been forgotten. Waiting for the one day, the one moment when everything would align. And now, the house would never feel like ours again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The last time anyone saw Sophia Hargrove alive, it was her 16th birthday. The date was etched into local folklore like a scar, October 19th, 1996. Sophia, with her long auburn hair and wide, innocent eyes, vanished during her own birthday party. Her parents had rented out the old community center at the edge of town, a place that had been standing since the 1800s. It was creaky, drafty, and smelled of mildew, but for Sophia, it was the perfect place to celebrate. When the police investigated, they found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no broken windows, not even a scuff on the polished wooden floor. Sophia had simply disappeared. For years, the case remained open but cold, and as the town moved on, the Hargrove family didn't. They moved away, leaving their once cheerful Victorian home to crumble under the weight of neglect. 27 years later, Sarah Walsh was scrolling through her phone when she saw the listing. Historic home available for rent, perfect for families. The house was beautiful in the photos, albeit a little old-fashioned. But what caught Sarah's eye was the rent. It was dirt cheap for such a large property. She couldn't resist. By the time she moved in with her husband, Mark, and their 7-year-old daughter, Emily, the house felt even more perfect in person. Sure, the wallpaper was peeling in places, and the hardwood floors creaked with every step, but it had charm. A history. On the second night, Emily found the room. "Mommy, can I have the attic for my playroom?" Emily asked, her bright eyes gleaming with excitement. Sarah and Mark exchanged glances. The attic door had been jammed shut when they arrived. Mark had to pry it open with a crowbar just to see what was inside. But Emily had been persistent, and the room did have a certain charm with its slanted ceiling, round window, and dust particles glittering in the sunlight. "Sure, sweetie," Sarah said with a smile, brushing off the eerie sensation that crept up her spine as they stood in the dusty space. The first week went by without incident. Sarah spent her days unpacking while Mark worked late at his new job. Emily spent hours in the attic, talking to her toys and humming little songs. One night, as Sarah was folding laundry, she heard giggles coming from above. She paused, tilting her head toward the ceiling. "Mark?" she called out, but there was no answer. He was still at work. She climbed the stairs to the attic. Pushing the door open, she found Emily sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by her dolls. "Who were you talking to, honey?" Sarah asked, smiling to mask her unease. Emily looked up, her face lit with excitement. "Sophia! She's really nice, Mommy. She says she used to live here." Sarah's smile faltered. She knelt down beside her daughter. "Emily, there's no one here but us." "But she's right there," Emily insisted, pointing to the far corner of the room. Sarah turned, her gaze landing on an empty rocking chair. It swayed slightly, as if someone had just been sitting in it. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Doors would creak open on their own. Lights flickered without reason. Once, Sarah found Emily's dolls arranged in a perfect circle in the living room, something Emily swore she hadn't done. Mark dismissed it all. "Old houses have quirks," he said with a shrug. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But Sarah wasn't so sure, especially when Emily started waking up at 3 a.m. every night, claiming Sophia wanted to play. One evening, Sarah decided to investigate. She climbed into the attic alone, a flashlight in hand. The air was colder up there, almost biting. As she swept the beam across the room, her eyes landed on a small wooden chest tucked in the corner. Inside were old photographs, letters, and what looked like a diary. The name Sophia Hargrove was scribbled in elegant handwriting on the first page. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through the diary. Sophia wrote about her life, her friends, her hopes and dreams. But the last entry was different. October 19th, 1996. "I'm so excited for my party tonight, but something feels wrong. There's a man who keeps watching me. I told my parents, but they said I was imagining things. I don't think I'll be safe tonight." Sarah's stomach churned. She closed the diary and placed it back in the chest. As she stood, she felt a sudden chill, like icy fingers brushing against her neck. She spun around, her flashlight flickering. The rocking chair began to move again, this time with more force. And then, faintly, she heard it, a whisper. "Help me." The next day, Sarah did some digging at the library. She found old newspaper articles about Sophia's disappearance. The most chilling detail was that it happened at her 16th birthday party, the same party where she had complained about being watched. That night, Sarah confronted Emily. "Honey, I need to know about Sophia." "What does she tell you?" Emily hesitated, her small face serious. "She says she's still waiting for her birthday cake. She says she can't leave until she gets it." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. Why not? Emily's eyes filled with tears. Because the bad man took her, and she's scared. Determined to put an end to the haunting, Sarah decided to bake a cake. It felt silly, almost absurd, but if it would give Sophia peace, it was worth trying. On October 19th, exactly 27 years after Sophia's disappearance, Sarah placed the finished cake in the attic. She lit 16 candles and whispered, "Happy birthday, Sophia." The air grew heavy, and the room seemed to darken. Then, for the first time, Sarah saw her. Sophia was standing in the corner, her figure faint but unmistakable. Her wide eyes were filled with tears, her party dress torn and dirty. "Thank you," Sophia whispered, her voice soft and trembling. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut. The candles blew out. And then came the sound, a low, guttural growl, inhuman and menacing. Sarah turned to see a shadowy figure looming behind Sophia. It reached for her, its long, clawed fingers wrapping around her arm. Sophia screamed, her voice echoing through the house. "No!" Sarah shouted, lunging forward, but her hands passed through both of them, as if they weren't really there. The figure dragged Sophia into the darkness, her cries fading into silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The attic was empty. The cake sat untouched, the candles melted into waxy puddles. That night, Sarah packed up her family and left the house. She couldn't explain what she had seen, and she didn't want to. All she knew was that Sophia wasn't at peace, and neither was whatever else lingered in that house. Months later, the Hargrove house was condemned. No one ever moved in again. But every year on October 19th, neighbors report seeing a light in the attic and hearing the faint sound of a girl crying. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
It was the fall of 2003, and the chilly October air had begun settling over the small town of Wycliffe. The golden hues of autumn leaves contrasted against the graying skies. But for 19-year-old Clara Haywood, the season brought with it an unsettling sense of unease. Clara had never been one for celebrating her birthday, especially since her mother's death 8 years prior. Yet, this year, her best friends, Mia and Lisa, insisted they throw her a party. "It'll be fun," Mia had said, grinning from ear to ear. "You've been moping around for too long. This is your 20th birthday. We have to do something special." Clara reluctantly agreed. After all, she didn't want to disappoint her friends, even if she couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread that had been creeping up on her for days. They decided on a small gathering at Clara's childhood home, an old Victorian house on the edge of town that she had inherited from her late mother. The house had always been a bit eerie, with its creaky floorboards, flickering lights, and the way shadows seemed to linger too long in the corners. But Clara dismissed it as the quirks of an old home. The night of the party arrived, and Clara stood in the living room, adjusting the banner that read, "Happy Birthday." The room was modestly decorated with balloons and streamers, and a cake sat on the coffee table, its white frosting glistening under the dim light. Mia and Lisa were busy setting up snacks in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. "It's probably Dan and Olivia," Mia called out. Clara walked to the door, her bare feet padding softly against the wooden floor. She opened it, expecting to see their mutual friends, but there was no one there. The chilly wind rushed past her, making her shiver. "Hello?" she called out, peering into the darkness. The street was empty, save for the faint rustle of leaves blowing across the pavement. "Who was it?" Lisa asked, poking her head out of the kitchen. "No one," Clara replied, frowning. She shut the door, locking it behind her. The rest of the guests arrived shortly after, filling the house with laughter and chatter. For a while, Clara managed to push aside her unease. They played games, told stories, and eventually gathered in the living room for the cake. As Mia lit the candles, Clara felt a strange sensation wash over her, a mix of anxiety and something deeper, something darker. "Make a wish," Lisa said, nudging her playfully. Clara hesitated before leaning forward and blowing out the candles. The room erupted in cheers, but as the smoke from the candles curled into the air, she thought she saw something. No, someone. Someone, standing in the corner of the room. A shadowy figure, barely visible, but unmistakably there. She blinked, and it was gone. "You okay?" Mia asked, noticing the way Clara's face had gone pale. "Yeah," Clara lied. "Just thought I saw something." As the night went on, the strange occurrences began to escalate. It started with small things. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the sound of footsteps on the stairs when everyone was accounted for in the living room. Then, the temperature in the house began to drop, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Around midnight, Dan suggested they play a game of truth or dare. They all sat in a circle, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on their faces. The dares started off harmless. Someone had to chug a soda, someone else had to run outside barefoot. But when it was Clara's turn, Dan grinned mischievously. "Truth or dare?" he asked. "Truth," Clara said, feeling too unsettled for anything risky. Dan's grin widened. "Okay, do you believe in ghosts?" The question sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She hesitated, glancing around the room. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe." "Well, you should," Dan said, his tone suddenly serious, "especially in this house." The group fell silent, the mood shifting. "What do you mean?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. Dan leaned forward, his expression grave. "You guys don't know about this place, do you?" "Dan, stop," Clara said, her stomach twisting into knots. "This isn't funny." "I'm not trying to scare you," he said, "but this house has a history. My grandma told me about it when I was a kid. A family used to live here in the 1950s. Parents and their young daughter, Eleanor. On her 12th birthday, she went missing during her own party. They never found her, and people say her spirit still lingers here, waiting for someone to help her." "Shut up, Dan," Mia snapped. "You're just trying to freak us out." "I'm serious," Dan insisted. "Ask anyone in town." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the stories before, but had always dismissed them as urban legends. Now, sitting in the dimly lit room, she wasn't so sure. As the night wore on, Clara began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. One by one, her friends started to leave, until it was just her, Mia, and Lisa. They decided to clean up before heading to bed, but as Clara was gathering empty cups from the living room, she heard it, a faint voice, almost like a child's, calling her name. Clara, she froze, her heart pounding. Did you hear that? She whispered to Mia, who was standing nearby. Hear what? Mia asked, her brow furrowed. Before Clara could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The sound of laughter, a child's laughter, echoed through the room, sending a wave of terror through Clara. Who's there? She shouted, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw her. A little girl, standing at the edge of the room, her white party dress stained and torn. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. Help me, the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. Clara stumbled backward, dropping the cups she was holding. Who are you? She managed to choke out. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the staircase, her hand trembling. Clara felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to follow. Against her better judgment, she found herself climbing the stairs, Mia and Lisa trailing behind her, their faces pale with fear. At the top of the stairs, the girl disappeared, but the pull remained. It led Clara to the attic, a place she hadn't been in years. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, the musty scent of dust and decay filled her nostrils. The room was empty, save for an old trunk in the corner. Clara hesitated before kneeling down and opening it. Inside, she found a collection of photographs, a torn party invitation, and a porcelain doll with a cracked face. And then, at the bottom of the trunk, she saw it, a small, blood-stained shoe. Eleanor, Clara whispered, the name coming to her as if from some long-buried memory. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and the laughter returned, louder and more menacing. Shadows danced across the walls, and the temperature plummeted. Clara, the voice called again, but this time it wasn't the child's. It was deeper, darker, filled with malice. Leave her alone, Clara shouted, clutching the shoe in her hand. She's just a child. The laughter stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the attic filled with a deafening roar, and the shadows converged into a towering figure with glowing red eyes. It lunged toward Clara, but just as it reached her, the little girl appeared again, stepping between them. Go away, Eleanor screamed, her voice filled with an otherworldly power. The figure hesitated before letting out a final bone-chilling scream and dissolving into darkness. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. Clara looked down at the little girl, who was now smiling faintly. Thank you, Eleanor whispered before fading away, her presence leaving the room cold but peaceful. Clara, Mia, and Lisa stumbled out of the attic, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They didn't speak as they packed their things and left the house that night, vowing never to return. The house was eventually sold to a new family, but Clara never forgot Eleanor's face or the way she had saved her. Every year on her birthday, Clara lit a candle for the little girl who never got to grow up, hoping it would bring her some semblance of peace.
Story number 4.
It was the fall of 2005, and my 25th birthday was supposed to be a quiet celebration. My fiancée, Erin, and I had just moved into a quaint little house in the countryside, a fixer-upper, she called it. It was old, charming in its way, but something about the place made my skin crawl from the moment we stepped through the front door. Erin loved it, though, and her excitement had dulled my reservations. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the creaks and groans of a house older than both of us combined. When my birthday came around, Erin insisted on throwing a small party. It'll make this place feel more like home, she said, grinning as she unpacked a box of streamers and balloons. I wasn't thrilled about it. I hadn't slept well since moving in. Every night, I woke up at odd hours, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something or someone moving through the house. Erin said it was just the house settling, but I wasn't so sure. Still, I agreed to the party. It was easier than arguing. The night of the party, a few close friends gathered in our dimly lit dining room. Erin had gone all out with decorations and a chocolate cake she made herself. We laughed, played board games, and drank more wine than we probably should have. For a while, I forgot about the unsettling feelings I'd been having since moving in. But as the clock neared midnight, the mood shifted. It started with the lights. The chandelier above the table flickered once, then again. We laughed it off, blaming the old wiring, but I couldn't help noticing the way the room grew colder. Erin must have felt it too because she fetched a sweater from the living room. Then came the footsteps. I was mid-sentence, telling a story about a childhood birthday, when the sound stopped me cold. Faint, deliberate footsteps echoed above us, on the second floor. Everyone froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "Did you invite anyone else?" my friend Ben asked, his voice low. "No," I said. "It's just us." "Probably the house," Erin said quickly, though her smile faltered. "Old floorboards make noise." But we all knew what we heard. The steps weren't random creaks, they were steady, purposeful, and they seemed to be coming closer, to the staircase. "Let's check it out," Ben said, already on his feet. He grabbed one of the candles from the cake, holding it like a makeshift flashlight. I followed reluctantly, my heart hammering in my chest. We climbed the stairs slowly, the candlelight casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before us, dark and silent. "Hello?" Ben called out. His voice echoed faintly, but there was no response. We checked every room, first the guest bedroom, then the office, and finally the master bedroom. Nothing. The rooms were empty, the windows locked, and the doors exactly as we had left them. "See, it's nothing," Erin said when we returned to the dining room. She tried to sound cheerful, but the unease in her voice was clear. The rest of the evening passed quietly, though the earlier excitement had faded. By 1 a.m., everyone had left, and Erin and I were alone. She cleaned up the dishes while I lingered in the living room, staring at the staircase. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I told myself it was all in my head. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't the sound of footsteps this time. It was the feeling. A cold, heavy weight pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I opened my eyes and froze. There, at the foot of the bed, stood a woman. Her figure was faint, almost transparent, but I could make out the details. The tattered dress, the long, tangled hair, and her face. God, her face! It was pale and hollow, her eyes black pits that seemed to stare straight into my soul. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, watching. I wanted to scream to wake Erin, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare back at her. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. I shot upright, gasping for air. The room was empty, but the oppressive cold lingered. Erin stirred beside me, mumbling something in her sleep, but I didn't dare wake her. I lay back down, heart racing, and didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Erin what I saw. She tried to reassure me, saying it was just a bad dream, but I knew better. The woman was real. I could still feel her presence, even in the daylight. Determined to understand what was happening, I started researching the house. It didn't take long to find the story. In the 1920s, the house had belonged to a family, the Carters. On October 15th, 1925, their youngest daughter, Eleanor, celebrated her 16th birthday. The family threw a grand party, inviting all the neighbors. But at some point during the night, Eleanor disappeared. They found her the next morning in the basement, her neck broken, her body crumpled at the bottom of the stairs. The official story was that she fell, but rumors swirled for years. Some said she was pushed, others claimed she jumped. But one detail remained consistent. Every year on October 15th, people reported strange occurrences in the house, footsteps, whispers, and the ghostly figure of a young woman in a tattered dress. I told Erin what I found, but she was skeptical. "It's just a story," she said. "People love to make up ghost tales about old houses." But I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was still here. And as my birthday, the same date as hers, approached, the activity in the house only grew worse. Doors slammed on their own, objects moved when no one was around, and every night at exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. The night of my birthday, I couldn't sleep. Erin had fallen asleep hours ago, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, dreading what I knew was coming. At 3:12 a.m., the footsteps began, slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs one by one. I held my breath, my heart pounding as the sound grew closer, and then the door to our bedroom creaked open. There she was. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She raised one hand, pointing to the hallway, and then turned, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know what compelled me to follow her, but I did. Grabbing my phone for light, I stepped into the hallway. The air was freezing, my breath visible in the faint glow of the screen. She led me to the basement. The door was already open, revealing the steep, narrow staircase. I hesitated, but the pull was stronger than my fear. I descended slowly, the creak of each step echoing in the silence. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement was empty, but then I saw it, scratched into the wall, faint but unmistakable. Help me. A cold wind swept through the basement, and I felt her presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw Eleanor again, her form flickering like a dying candle. She didn't speak, but her expression was one of pain, of desperation. "What do you want?" I whispered. She pointed to the floor. Confused, I knelt down, brushing away the dirt and debris. My fingers scraped against something hard, wood, a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a locket, tarnished with age. I opened it, revealing a photograph of a young Eleanor and a man I didn't recognize. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and a voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice, echoed around me. "Leave." The locket flew out of my hand, and the basement door slammed shut. The shadows seemed to close in, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't make it out. But then Eleanor appeared between me and the shadows, her faint light pushing back the darkness. She saved me. When I stumbled out of the basement, the house was silent. The oppressive cold was gone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt peace. I buried the locket in the backyard the next morning, saying a quiet prayer for Eleanor. The footsteps stopped after that, and I never saw her again. But every year on my birthday, I leave a single candle burning in the window, just in case she's still watching. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
The year was 2002, and the small New England town of Mill Haven was already draped in the damp chill of late October. I was turning 13 that year, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I begged my parents not to throw me a party. I didn't feel like celebrating. Something about my birthday always made me uneasy. Maybe it was because it was so close to Halloween, or maybe it was something deeper, a sense of dread I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. But my parents insisted. "You're only 13 once," my mom said, smiling as she brought home balloons and streamers. "You'll regret it if you don't celebrate with your friends." I doubted that, but arguing with her was pointless. By the afternoon of October 24th, our old Victorian house was alive with activity. The dining room was filled with the smells of pizza, cake, and popcorn, and my dad had set up a few games in the living room for the dozen or so kids that arrived. My best friend, Tommy, was the first through the door. He gave me a half smirk as he handed me a lopsided gift bag. "You don't look happy for someone having a party," he said. I shrugged. I didn't really want one. Tommy rolled his eyes, but didn't say anything. We drifted to the living room where the others were gathering, and I tried to push aside the gnawing anxiety in my chest. The party was fine at first. Loud, chaotic, and full of laughter like any normal birthday party. But things started to feel strange around 8 p.m. after my mom brought out the cake. The house was already old, and it always had a way of creaking when you least expected it, but as the candles on the cake flickered, the air seemed to shift. The dining room grew colder, and for a moment the lights above the table dimmed. "Power surge," my dad muttered, frowning at the chandelier. He clapped his hands, trying to lighten the mood. "All right, blow out those candles, kiddo." I leaned forward, feeling the eyes of everyone at the table on me. As I took a deep breath, something caught my attention, a shadow, faint but distinct, moving across the far wall. It was gone before I could react. "Make a wish," someone shouted, jolting me back to the moment. I blew out the candles and the room erupted into cheers, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The first truly strange thing happened about 20 minutes later. We just started a game of hide and seek, Tommy volunteering to be it. As he counted down from 20, the rest of us scattered throughout the house. I decided to hide upstairs in the guest room at the end of the hall. It was rarely used, and I figured it'd be one of the last places Tommy would look. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of the others giggling and whispering as they found their own hiding spots. I crouched behind an old armchair, my heart pounding as I waited. But after a few minutes, the air in the room seemed to change. At first, it was the temperature. The room, already cool, grew icy, my breath visible in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Then came the sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like a child humming. I froze. The humming grew louder, though it wasn't coming from outside the room or even the hallway. It was coming from the corner, just a few feet away. Slowly, I peeked out from behind the chair. There was a girl standing there. She was about my age, wearing a pale dress that looked decades out of style. Her hair was long and dark, and her face was turned away from me. Her head tilted slightly as she hummed that haunting melody. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body was paralyzed with fear. And then, as if sensing my presence, she stopped humming. Slowly, impossibly slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were black, not just dark, but pitch black, like twin voids that seemed to swallow the dim light of the room. Her lips curled into a faint, unnatural smile. "Happy birthday," she whispered. I bolted. I don't remember running down the stairs, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was back in the dining room, gasping for air as my friends and parents stared at me. "What's wrong?" Tommy asked, his brow furrowed. There's someone upstairs," I stammered. My dad frowned, glancing at my mom before heading toward the staircase. "Probably one of your friends. I'll check it out." I tried to stop him, tried to tell him it wasn't a friend, but the words wouldn't come out. My mom put a reassuring hand on my shoulder, but even she looked concerned. Dad came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. "No one's up there," he said. "You probably scared yourself hiding in the dark." I knew what I saw. The rest of the night was tense. My friends tried to lighten the mood, but the laughter felt forced. When the party finally ended and the last guest left, I thought I could finally breathe. But the night wasn't over. At 3:07 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone walking down the upstairs hallway. The house was silent, save for the slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to echo far louder than they should have. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. "Mom?" I whispered. No response. I got out of bed, my legs shaking as I tiptoed toward the door. Slowly, I turned the knob and pulled it open. The hallway was empty, but then I saw it. The guest room door at the end of the hall was open, though I was certain we'd closed it earlier. And there, standing in the doorway, was the girl. Her black eyes locked onto mine, and she raised one hand, pointing toward the stairs. "Come play," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. I slammed the door and scrambled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when morning finally came, I told my parents everything. To my surprise, they didn't dismiss me. My mom's face grew pale as I described the girl, and my dad sat silently, his jaw clenched. "We should have told you," Mom finally said, her voice trembling. "Told me what?" Mom hesitated before continuing. "When we bought this house, the realtor mentioned a history. There was a family that lived here in the 1930s. Their daughter, Annabelle, died in an accident. She fell down the stairs on her birthday." I stared at her, my blood running cold. "They say her spirit never left," Mom whispered. "But you didn't think it was real," I finished for her. Dad put a hand on my shoulder. "We'll figure this out. Maybe we can bless the house or something." But I knew it wouldn't matter. Annabelle was here, and she wasn't going anywhere. For years after that night, I avoided my birthday. No parties, no celebrations, nothing to mark the day. I moved out of that house when I turned 18, but the memory of Annabelle, the black-eyed girl who whispered my name, never left me. And every October, as the date approaches, I swear I can still hear her humming, faint and distant, like a ghost of a memory I'll never escape. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was October 2004, and my 14th birthday was supposed to be a quiet affair. My mom had planned a small celebration with just a few friends and family at our home in rural Pennsylvania. I wasn't particularly excited about it, but birthdays were a big deal to my mom, and after the year we'd had, I didn't want to disappoint her. We had moved into this old farmhouse about 6 months prior. It had been vacant for years, sitting at the edge of a dense forest, with a sagging porch and a backyard that stretched into the woods. My mom had fallen in love with its rustic charm, even though it had clearly seen better days. I, on the other hand, hated it. The house had a heavy, unsettling atmosphere, and I always felt like someone was watching me when I walked through the hallways. The day of my birthday was cold and overcast. My two best friends, Emily and Jake, arrived after lunch, and the three of us hung out in my room while my mom finished setting up downstairs. Emily had brought a Polaroid camera, something she was obsessed with at the time, and we spent the afternoon taking silly pictures. Jake, who was always a bit of a skeptic about everything, rolled his eyes every time she made us pose. At around 6 p.m., the rest of the guests arrived, my aunt, uncle, and a couple of neighbors my mom had befriended. We gathered in the dining room, where the table was covered in snacks and a cake decorated with the words, "Happy 14th, Claire," in bright pink icing. My mom had hung streamers and balloons, but somehow the room still felt dim despite the decorations. The light seemed to struggle to reach the corners, leaving them shrouded in shadows. As I blew out the candles on my cake, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, just a shadow darting along the far wall, but it was enough to make me pause. I looked up, scanning the room, but everyone was focused on the cake. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After dinner, Emily suggested we play a game of hide and seek. "It'll be way more fun in this creepy old house," she said, grinning mischievously. "I don't know." I hesitated, glancing at Jake. "Oh, come on," Emily urged. "It's your birthday. What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, I agreed. My mom, aunt, and uncle stayed in the living room, chatting over coffee, while the three of us ran off to start the game. Jake volunteered to count first, and Emily and I split up to find hiding spots. I decided to hide in the attic. It was the one place I had avoided since we moved in. There was something about it, the creaking floorboards, the cobwebs clinging to the low beams, the way it smelled of mildew and dust, that made my skin crawl. But I figured Jake wouldn't think to look there, and I wanted to win. The attic was dark, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. I crouched behind a stack of old boxes, trying to make myself as small as possible. The house was silent except for the distant sound of Jake's voice calling out numbers and the faint hum of conversation downstairs. Then I heard it. A soft creak, like someone stepping onto the attic stairs. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to hear. The creaking grew louder, closer, until it stopped just beyond the boxes where I was hiding. "Jake?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response. I peeked out from behind the boxes, expecting to see him grinning down at me, but the attic was empty. The air felt heavier now, colder, and the single bulb flickered weakly, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I was about to stand up when I heard it, a low, rasping whisper, so faint I couldn't make out the words. It came from the far corner of the attic, where the shadows were deepest. My stomach dropped as I stared into the darkness, my eyes adjusting just enough to make out a figure. A woman, standing perfectly still, her face obscured by a veil of stringy hair. She was barefoot, her dress tattered and stained, and her arms hung limply at her sides. I froze, unable to move or even scream. The woman tilted her head as if studying me, and then she took a step forward. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being dragged along by invisible strings. "Claire," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. "Happy birthday." I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping as I raced down to the second floor. I didn't stop until I reached the dining room where Emily and Jake were waiting. "You okay?" Jake asked, frowning. "There's someone in the attic," I gasped, clutching the edge of the table to steady myself. Emily's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "A woman," I said, my voice shaking. She said my name." Jake glanced at Emily, then back at me. "Are you messing with us?" "I'm not," I snapped. "I swear she was there." Before either of them could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief darkness before snapping back on. My mom and the others rushed in from the living room, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" my mom asked. "I saw someone in the attic," I said again, my voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." My mom frowned. "Claire, there's no one here but us. You must have imagined." She stopped mid-sentence as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house, coming from directly above us. Everyone froze. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and unmistakably coming from the attic. My mom's face went pale. "Stay here," she said, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. "No." I grabbed her arm. "Don't go up there." She hesitated, looking at me, and I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. Finally, she nodded. "We're leaving. Now." We grabbed our coats and hurried out the front door. As we piled into the cars, I glanced back at the house. In one of the attic windows, I saw her again, the woman, standing motionless, her dark silhouette framed by the faint glow of the moon. We didn't go back to the house for weeks. My mom hired someone to pack up our belongings and put the place on the market. She never asked me for details about what I saw, and I never volunteered them. But sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake and hear her crying softly in her room. Years later, I learned the truth. The woman in the attic was named Margaret, a former resident of the house. In 1952, on her daughter's 14th birthday, Margaret had lost her mind and killed the girl, pushing her down the attic stairs. The family had kept it quiet, but rumors persisted, and the house had gained a reputation for being haunted. To this day, I can still hear Margaret's whisper, that cold, rasping voice wishing me a happy birthday. And every year as my birthday approaches, I wonder if she's still waiting for me in that attic, her dark eyes watching, her voice calling my name. Story the end. The end.
Story number 7.
It was October 2003, and my 17th birthday was shaping up to be one I'd never forget, though not for the reasons I hoped. My family had recently moved to a small town in the Midwest, settling into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. My dad loved its character, but I found the place unsettling. There was something about the narrow hallways, creaking floorboards, and the way shadows seemed to linger just a little too long in the corners. My mom, however, was determined to make the house feel like home, and my birthday was her first big opportunity. She decorated the living room with streamers and balloons, baked a cake from scratch, and even invited a few kids from my new school to make me feel more welcome. I didn't know these kids well, but I appreciated the effort. The day started out uneventfully enough. A few friends arrived in the late afternoon, and we spent some time awkwardly chatting and playing board games in the living room. As the sun began to set, my mom suggested we head to the dining room for dinner. That's when things started to feel off. The dining room was darker than the rest of the house, even with the overhead chandelier on. The wallpaper was faded and peeling in places, and the heavy oak furniture seemed out of place, like it belonged to a different era. As we sat down, I noticed the air felt colder here, despite the warmth of the candles my mom had lit. "Happy birthday, Elise," my mom said with a big smile, setting the cake down in front of me. The candles flickered as she placed it on the table, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move along the far wall. I glanced over, but nothing was there. Just the old china cabinet with its glass doors reflecting the candlelight. "Make a wish," someone said, pulling me back to the moment. I blew out the candles and everyone clapped and cheered. But as the smoke curled upward, I caught the faintest sound, like a whisper, soft and indistinct, coming from somewhere behind me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking around the table. "Hear what?" Jake, one of the kids from school, said, raising an eyebrow. "It sounded like someone whispering," I said, my voice trailing off. Everyone exchanged nervous glances, but no one said anything. My mom laughed lightly, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. After dinner, the group moved back to the living room, but I lingered in the dining room, staring at the china cabinet. Something about it was drawing me in, though I couldn't say why. As I stepped closer, I noticed that one of the glass doors was slightly ajar. Inside, there was a collection of old plates and cups, most of them dusty and unused. But on the bottom shelf, there was something that didn't belong. A small, faded photograph. I picked it up carefully. It showed a young girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, sitting on the steps of a house that looked eerily similar to ours. She had dark hair pulled back with a ribbon and was holding a stuffed bear. But her expression sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes looked hollow, almost lifeless, and there was a strange blur around her figure like the photograph had been damaged. "Elise? What are you doing?" My mom's voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the photo. Nothing, I said quickly, shoving the picture back onto the shelf and closing the cabinet door. She gave me a puzzled look, but didn't press further. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and my parents had gone to bed, I stayed up in my room, scrolling through my phone. The house was quiet, but the kind of quiet that felt oppressive, like it was waiting for something. I kept thinking about the photo, about the girl's empty eyes and the strange blur around her. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. At first, I thought it was my dad heading to the bathroom, but the steps were too light, too deliberate. They stopped just outside my door, and I held my breath, waiting for the knock. It never came. Instead, the doorknob rattled softly as if someone were trying to turn it. "Mom?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I got out of bed and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt icy, and I swear I could smell something faintly sweet like old perfume. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, before quickly shutting the door and locking it. The next morning, I told my mom about the footsteps, but she dismissed it, saying old houses make all kinds of noises. I wanted to believe her, but the uneasiness in my chest wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Objects in the house started moving, small things at first, like a chair slightly out of place or a book left open on the table. My mom blamed me, saying I needed to be more careful, but I knew it wasn't me. Then there were the whispers. Late at night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I'd hear them, soft, almost indecipherable, but always coming from the direction of the dining room. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept downstairs, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. The dining room was dark, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt that same cold, oppressive air I'd felt on my birthday. My flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the china cabinet. The door was open again. I moved closer, my hands trembling as I reached for the photograph, but it wasn't there. Instead, the shelf where it had been was now covered in a thin layer of frost. And then, behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam caught something in the corner of the room. A figure, barely visible, standing just at the edge of the light. It was the girl from the photograph. Her dark hair hung limply around her face, and her eyes were just as hollow as they'd been in the picture. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity before her lips moved. "Why did you come here?" she whispered, her voice echoing like it was coming from deep inside the walls. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and in that moment, I felt something cold brush against my arm, like icy fingers. I bolted, running back upstairs and locking myself in my room. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I told my dad everything. For once, he didn't laugh or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he went pale. "Elise," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about this house." He explained that the previous owners had a daughter who had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. She had fallen down the stairs on her 10th birthday, breaking her neck. Her parents moved out shortly after, unable to bear the memories, and the house had been empty for years before we bought it. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. "I thought it was just a tragic accident." But I knew it wasn't just an accident. I could feel her presence, her anger, her sadness. She didn't want us there, and she wasn't going to let us stay. We moved out a few weeks later. My parents didn't give a clear reason to the realtor, just said that the house wasn't a good fit. I didn't care. I was just glad to be gone. Even now, years later, I still think about that girl, about her empty eyes and the way she whispered to me in the dark. Every time my birthday comes around, I can't help but feel a chill, like she's still out there, watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was March 2003, my 12th birthday, and I was supposed to be excited. My mom had planned a party with balloons, cake, and my 3 best friends from school. But the day started off strange, and it only got worse. Looking back, I realized there was something in the air that morning, an uneasy silence that hung over our house like a heavy fog. We had moved into the old house on Mill Creek Road 6 months earlier, It was big and drafty, with creaky wooden floors and wallpaper that looked like it belonged in another century. Mom loved it, though, said it was charming and had good bones. My dad, who worked long hours at his new job, didn't seem to care either way. The first odd thing happened during breakfast. My mom brought out a small cupcake with a single candle, singing "Happy Birthday" as she placed it in front of me. But as soon as she set it down, the candle went out. There wasn't any breeze or open window. It just died, as if someone had blown it out. My mom laughed nervously and relit it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time my friends arrived that afternoon, I was trying to push the weirdness out of my mind. The four of us, me, Sarah, Mia, and Kevin, gathered in the living room, playing board games while my mom baked my birthday cake in the kitchen. We were laughing and joking, trying to act like everything was normal. But then Sarah brought it up. "Your house is kind of creepy, you know?" she said, glancing at the old grandfather clock in the corner. Yeah, Mia agreed, looking around. "It's like it's too quiet here." I shrugged, pretending not to care. "It's just an old house." But Kevin, always the skeptic, leaned forward. "No, seriously, have you ever heard any weird noises or, seen anything?" I hesitated. I didn't want to admit it, but there had been strange things. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, doors that opened and closed on their own, and the feeling that someone was watching me when I walked past the upstairs landing. Before I could answer, my mom called us into the dining room for cake. The table was set with plates and candles, and the cake sat in the center, its pink frosting perfectly smooth. As I sat down, I noticed something strange. There was an extra place setting. "Mom," I asked, "why are there 5 plates? There are only 4 of us." She frowned, glancing at the table. "That's odd. I must have said it by accident." But I could tell from the look on her face that she didn't remember doing it. We lit the candles, and everyone sang "Happy Birthday." I made a wish, blew them out, and for a moment everything felt normal again. Then Sarah spoke up. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "See what?" I asked. She pointed toward the window. There was someone standing outside. We all turned to look, but the yard was empty. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their bare branches scratching against the side of the house. "It's probably just a shadow," Kevin said, trying to sound brave. But Sarah shook her head. "No, it was a person. A woman, I think." My mom tried to lighten the mood, insisting it was nothing, but I could see the worry in her eyes. After cake, we decided to play hide and seek. It was Kevin's idea, of course. He loved anything that might scare us. My mom stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up, while we spread out through the house. Kevin counted first, and the rest of us ran to find hiding spots. I chose the upstairs hallway closet. It was cramped and smelled faintly of mothballs, but it was dark, and I figured Kevin wouldn't look there. I could hear him downstairs, his footsteps echoing as he searched for Sarah and Mia. Then, as I stood there holding my breath, I heard something else, soft, shuffling footsteps coming from the other end of the hallway. "Kevin?" I whispered. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I realized they weren't Kevin's. They were too light, too slow. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back of the closet. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see out, and as I peered through the gap, I saw her. A woman, dressed in a long, faded dress, her hair hanging in dark, stringy strands around her face. She moved slowly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stopped in front of the closet, her head tilting slightly as if she could sense I was there. I froze, too terrified to even blink. Then, without warning, the door creaked open, but there was no one there. I ran downstairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, and found the others in the living room. They looked up as I burst in, my face pale and my hands shaking. "What's wrong?" Mia asked. "There's someone upstairs," I said, barely able to get the words out. Kevin frowned. "Are you sure? It's probably just your mom." "No," I insisted. "It's not her. It's someone else." Before they could respond, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. We all jumped, and my mom came running in, her face pale. "What was that?" she asked. We followed her to the kitchen, where one of the cabinet doors was hanging open, its contents spilled across the floor. Plates, cups, and silverware were scattered everywhere. But the thing that caught my eye was the photograph lying in the middle of the mess. It was old and faded, the edges curling with age. It showed a family standing in front of a house, our house. There was a man, a woman, and a young girl 7 or 8 years old. Maybe 7-year-old was holding a stuffed animal, her face unsmiling. "Where did this come from?" my mom asked, picking it up. None of us had an answer. That night, after my friends had gone home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the woman in the hallway, the photograph, and the extra place setting at the table. Something was wrong with this house, and I was starting to believe we weren't alone. At around midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were coming from downstairs. I lay in bed, frozen, listening as they moved through the house, pausing in the dining room before continuing toward the stairs. Then the whispering started. "Happy birthday." The voice was faint, almost sing-song, but it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out of my room, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the dining room came into view. The table was empty now, the cake and decorations gone, but the air felt cold and heavy. And then I saw her. She was sitting at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at me with those hollow, lifeless eyes. "Happy birthday, Elise," she whispered, a twisted smile spreading across her face. I screamed, dropping the flashlight, and when I looked back, she was gone. We moved out of the house a month later. My mom never talked about what happened that night, and neither did I. But every year on my birthday, I think about her, the woman in the hallway, the woman who knew my name. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice. "Happy birthday." Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was 2004, my 14th birthday, and we were celebrating in our new home, a modest 2-story house on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania. My mom loved the place because it was cozy, and my dad was thrilled about the price. They didn't seem to care that the house had been empty for almost a decade, or that the realtor mentioned something vague about the previous owners leaving in a hurry. For me, the house felt wrong from the moment we moved in. The air always seemed too cold, even in summer. The corners of the rooms were darker than they should have been, and at night, I sometimes heard faint creaks and whispers that couldn't be explained by old wood settling. But I didn't tell my parents, they'd just say I was imagining things. My birthday fell on a Friday that year, and my mom planned a small party with just my family and a couple of friends, Sarah and Max. It was supposed to be a quiet evening with pizza, a movie, and cake. I wasn't expecting much, but I hoped it would at least be fun enough to distract me from the unease that had been growing since we moved in. That afternoon, Sarah and Max arrived with gift bags in hand. We spent the first couple of hours hanging out in the living room, joking around and eating pizza while my mom put the finishing touches on the cake in the kitchen. Everything felt normal until it didn't. It started when Max asked to use the bathroom upstairs. He was gone for longer than he should have been, and when he came back, his face was pale and he looked shaken. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. Max hesitated, glancing at me and then at the staircase. "I swear I heard someone up there," he said finally, "like footsteps, but when I checked, there was no one around." I tried to laugh it off. "It's an old house. It makes noises sometimes." Max didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. Still, I couldn't shake the look on his face. It was like he'd seen something he couldn't explain but didn't want to talk about. A little while later, my mom brought out the cake. It was a simple chocolate cake with "Happy Birthday, Emma" written in white frosting. She lit the candles and everyone sang while I sat there, smiling and pretending I didn't feel like something was wrong. I blew out the candles, made my wish, and everyone clapped. That's when Sarah frowned and looked toward the dining room doorway. "Who's that?" she asked. We all turned to follow her gaze, but there was no one there. "What are you talking about?" my mom asked. Sarah shook her head, her expression confused. "I thought I saw someone standing there, just for a second. A woman, maybe?" My mom glanced at me, clearly trying to gauge my reaction. "There's no one here but us," she said firmly. "You must have imagined it." Sarah didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. After cake, we decided to watch a movie. My parents went upstairs to give us some space, and the three of us settled on the couch with a stack of DVDs. But about halfway through the movie, the TV screen flickered and went black. Great, Max muttered. Did you forget to pay the electricity bill? I rolled my eyes and got up to check the cables. Everything was plugged in and the lights were still on, so it wasn't a power outage. Just as I was about to suggest we try another movie, the screen flickered back on, but instead of the film we'd been watching, it was showing static. What the hell? Sarah whispered. We stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. Then, just for a moment, the static cleared and an image appeared. It was dark and blurry, but it looked like someone standing in a doorway, their figure just barely visible in the shadows. Turn it off, Max said, his voice tight. I fumbled for the remote, but before I could press the power button, the screen went black again. None of us wanted to admit how freaked out we were, so we tried to pretend everything was fine. We moved to the kitchen, where the overhead light was bright and reassuring, and played cards for a while. But the uneasy feeling lingered, like the house itself was watching us. Around 10 p.m., Max said he needed to head home, so Sarah and I walked him to the front door. As we said goodbye, I caught a glimpse of something through the living room window, a face pale and expressionless, staring in from outside. Did you see that? I whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm. She nodded, her eyes wide. There's someone out there. Max spun around, but by the time he looked, the face was gone. He shook his head, muttering something about us trying to scare him, and left quickly, pulling his hood up as he stepped into the night. Sarah decided to stay the night. After everything that had happened, neither of us wanted to be alone. We set up sleeping bags in my room and spent the next hour talking about anything but the strange things we'd seen. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of us, and we fell asleep with the lamp on. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The room was dark, even though I was sure we'd left the light on. For a moment, I thought I heard someone whispering, but when I turned my head, the sound stopped. I sat up, my heart pounding. Across the room, Sarah was still asleep, her face turned toward the wall. Everything was quiet, but the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The closet door was open. I was certain I'd closed it before we went to bed, but now it was open just a crack, enough for me to see the darkness inside. As I stared at it, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, the door creaked, opening a little wider. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. Then, slowly, something stepped out of the closet. It was a figure, a woman, her long hair matted and her face pale and expressionless. She moved toward me, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. "Happy birthday," she whispered, her voice barely audible but cold enough to send a shiver down my spine. I screamed, and the next thing I knew, Sarah was shaking me, her face full of panic. "What's wrong?" she asked. The room was bright again, the lamp casting its familiar glow. The closet door was closed and there was no sign of the woman. I thought I saw something," I stammered, my voice trembling. "Someone was in the room." Sarah didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me she believed me. The next morning, I told my mom what had happened. She tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a bad dream, but I could tell she didn't really believe it. A few weeks later, we moved out of the house. My parents said it was because my dad got a new job in another town, but I've always wondered if they experienced something they didn't want to admit. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Every time my birthday comes around, I can't help but feel a chill, like she's still there, watching, waiting for me to return. Story the end.
Story number 10.
My 13th birthday in 2002 was supposed to be special. It was the first birthday we were celebrating in our new home, a big old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. My parents had fallen in love with it at first sight, thrilled by its tall ceilings, intricate woodwork, and wraparound porch. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was cold, even on warm days, and the upstairs hallway always smelled faintly of smoke, though no one had ever mentioned a fire. That day started off normal enough. My mom had decorated the dining room with streamers and balloons, and she'd baked a chocolate cake, my favorite. My dad joked about how teenagers eat like wolves as he piled a mountain of snacks on the table. I'd invited a few friends, Leah, Jenna, and Adam, for a sleepover. We were planning to watch scary movies, eat junk food, and stay up late telling ghost stories. None of us could have guessed that we'd end up living one instead. Around 6 p.m., my friends arrived and the party began. We played games, opened presents, and stuffed ourselves with pizza and soda. By the time my mom brought out the cake, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the room. The glow from the candles seemed to make the darkness outside the windows even deeper. As everyone sang "Happy Birthday," I felt a strange unease settle over me, though I couldn't explain why. When I blew out the candles, the lights in the room flickered, just for a second, but long enough for everyone to notice. "Creepy," Leah said, glancing up at the chandelier. "Old house," my dad said with a shrug. "The wiring's probably a little finicky." We all laughed it off, but the feeling in my chest didn't go away. After cake, we moved into the living room to watch Poltergeist. My mom and dad said goodnight and headed upstairs, leaving us to our movie marathon. The room was dimly lit by the flickering TV, and we huddled together under a pile of blankets, jumping at every scare. About halfway through, Adam paused the movie to go to the bathroom. He was gone longer than expected, and when he came back, his face was pale. "What's wrong?" Jenna asked. Adam hesitated. I think I saw someone upstairs." Leah rolled her eyes. "Don't start trying to scare us." "I'm serious," Adam said. "When I was walking back, I saw someone standing at the end of the hallway. I thought it was your dad, but when I said hi, they just disappeared." A chill ran through me. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Adam nodded, his expression grim. "Positive." We tried to shake it off, convincing ourselves that Adam's imagination was running wild because of the movie. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. The house felt heavier, the shadows deeper. We decided to put on something lighter, a comedy, but none of us were really paying attention anymore. Around midnight, Leah suggested we play hide and seek. Jenna and I groaned, but Adam agreed enthusiastically, and soon we were all running through the house, trying to find hiding spots. I ended up in the small storage room under the stairs, crouched behind a pile of old boxes. The air in the room was stale and smelled faintly of mothballs, but it was quiet, and I figured I'd be hard to find. As I sat there in the dark, I heard faint footsteps in the hallway outside. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. At first, I thought it was Adam, but the longer I listened, the more I realized the steps were too heavy to be his. My heart started to race. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside the door. "Adam?" I whispered. There was no response, just silence. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My stomach dropped, and I pressed myself back against the boxes, praying whoever it was wouldn't come inside. The door creaked open, but instead of a face, I saw nothing but darkness. No one stepped inside, and after a few seconds, the door creaked shut again. The footsteps resumed, moving down the hallway and fading into the distance. When I finally emerged from the storage room, I found the others in the living room. Adam was pacing, his hands stuffed in his pockets, while Jenna and Leah sat on the couch, their faces pale. "Did something happen?" I asked. Leah nodded. "We heard something, upstairs." "What kind of something?" "Voices," Jenna whispered. "It sounded like a woman, but it didn't make any sense. It was just mumbling." My stomach turned. We need to tell my parents. We crept upstairs together, our footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. My parents' bedroom door was closed, and when I knocked, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and finally my mom opened the door, squinting at us in confusion. "What's wrong?" she asked. "We heard something," I said. "Voices and footsteps." My mom frowned, glancing back at my dad, who was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just the wind," she said. "This house is old. It makes noises." "But it sounded like someone was talking," Jenna insisted. My mom sighed. You kids are just scaring yourselves. Go back downstairs, okay? Everything's fine." We didn't argue, but as we walked back to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was wrong. Around 2 a.m., we decided to try and sleep. The four of us set up sleeping bags in the living room, but none of us could actually fall asleep. We lay there in the dark, whispering about the strange things that had happened until eventually exhaustion took over. I woke up sometime later to the sound of someone crying. It was faint but unmistakable, like a woman sobbing quietly. For a moment, I thought it was Leah or Jenna, but when I turned my head, I saw that both of them were fast asleep. The sound was coming from the dining room. I sat up, my heart pounding, and glanced toward the doorway. The crying grew louder, and then I saw her, a woman standing in the shadows at the edge of the room. She was wearing a long, tattered dress, and her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. She was staring at me, her eyes hollow and empty. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you let it happen?" I froze, unable to move or speak. Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. The dining room was empty, and the house was silent once more. The next morning, I told my parents what I'd seen. They exchanged a look I couldn't quite read before my dad finally spoke. "This house has a history," he admitted. "We didn't want to tell you because we didn't want to scare you, but something bad happened here." "What do you mean?" I asked. "A fire," he said. "Years ago, a woman and her daughter lived here, and the house caught fire while they were asleep. They didn't make it." My blood ran cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" "We thought it was just an old story," my mom said. "We didn't think." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. I knew what she was thinking. They didn't think the house would still remember. We moved out a month later. My parents said it was because my dad got a job in another state, but I knew the real reason. The house wasn't ours. It never had been. And sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear her voice in my dreams. "Why did you let it happen?" Story the end.